Thank you for joining us for the Trimarc webcast. We'll get started in just a minute or so. We do have another webcast that's going to be happening next month in July. That's going to focus on protecting AD administration. You can register for that at the registration link at the bottom, trimarc.co/security-webcast. We will get started in just another minute or so while we wait for some others to join. Thank you for attending our webcast. Just a quick note about Trimarc. Thank you for joining our webcast. Trimarc performs security assessments for specific areas. We focus on Active Directory, Microsoft Office 365 and Azure Active Directory, and VMware. These are comprehensive reviews of these environments. We provide detailed, actionable recommendations, and we provide a roadmap to improve the security posture of each of these areas. Trimarc's flagship security offering, an assessment offering, is our Active Directory Security Assessment. The Trimarc ADSA is an extremely comprehensive AD-focused security assessment. We cover all the key areas that attackers would review and potentially leverage to compromise AD. During this assessment, we use a proprietary Trimarc-developed assessment tool to quickly identify issues. Then Trimarc personnel review the gathered data to identify any other potential issues in the environment. This includes AD permissions, group policy settings, group policy permissions, group membership, and other ways that permissions and rights can be configured in AD. Our goal is to find all of the potential escalation paths in the AD forest and provide actionable, detailed remediation items. During the reporting process, we perform extensive internal review of the report to help identify additional security issues. And every person who works on engagements has 10 years or more in operations. And when we combine that with our security vision, we're able to provide detailed recommendations to resolve these identified issues. I'm happy to announce that we have a new offering, the Trimarc Active Directory Security Review. This is focused on smaller organizations with a single domain Active Directory forest who still want an Active Directory review from Trimarc with the recommendations that we typically provide, again, that are custom and actionable. Timeline is shorter since we don't go as in-depth as we do with AD permissions and don't review the domain controller configuration in the same level of detail as we do with our ADSA. Great thing about the new Trimarc ADSR is that we don't require access to the corporate network. Instead, we provide a PowerShell script to get the required data that the customer can run and provide that back to us through our secure portal. The entire engagement is performed offline, takes about 2 weeks to review and analyze and write the report. We are initially looking to deliver this offering to nonprofit organizations and those companies who are looking to be acquired or are acquiring companies for mergers and acquisitions. We're happy to announce that we're launching this in fall 2020, so feel free to reach out to us on the Trimarc website if you're interested in getting on that list. So welcome to the Trimarc webcast. This is Securing Active Directory, performing your own Active Directory security review. I'm going to cover a number of things during this presentation. There will be Q&A, question and answer, after the presentation, so please submit your questions and the moderators will review and publish those questions. Thumbs up and like the questions that you want to hear answered. The most popular ones will be answered first. I will do that Q&A after the presentation, so Q&A may run beyond the 1 hour time, but I'll stay online to answer those questions. Links to the slides and the recording will be posted to the Trimarc webcast page at trimarc.co/security-webcast in the next day or so. And let's get started. So I'm Sean Metcalf. I'm the founder of Trimarc, a professional services company. We focus on helping organizations better secure their Microsoft platform, including the Microsoft Cloud and now VMware. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master in Active Directory, a Microsoft MVP, and I've spoken at a number of security conferences. Own and operate ADsecurity.org as well. And the agenda for today is identifying AD security issues. So this presentation will cover some key AD security items to review and how to do it. The security items covered here are not comprehensive, but we are going to show PowerShell code that we use to gather the AD data for the purposes of the presentation. And in the PowerShell script we will provide after this webcast, we'll have that PowerShell code as well, which is focused on a single domain AD forest or one domain and a multi-domain AD forest. The PowerShell script gathers the domain data using the Active Directory PowerShell module and displays on the screen and in a transcript file, as well as saves the collected data to a CSV or a text file. And I'll do a brief demo at the end showing the Invoke-TrimarcADChecks PowerShell script. So shout out to Mark Morrow on Twitter, who wanted me to remind everyone to enforce MFA on all privileged Azure AD and Office 365 accounts. So if you have Azure Active Directory and Office 365, make sure that you're doing that, or even better, enforce the control of Azure AD roles with privileged identity management, PIM. So let's get started. This is the core of the presentation. I'm going to cover the most common issues we see during Active Directory security assessments. Not only am I talking about what those are, but more importantly, how you can identify them and some actions you can take to resolve them. Again, we're providing a free PowerShell script after this webcast, which includes all the PowerShell code you see in this presentation. Note that this is not PowerShell training, and the code is shown just to demonstrate how these AD checks can be performed. Of course, feel free to contact Trimarc to perform a comprehensive Active Directory security assessment, which covers the items discussed in this presentation, plus many, many more. We probably do over 500 different Active Directory security checks as part of our comprehensive AD review. So when we're looking at Active Directory, we want to check for potential issues with user accounts in the AD environment. So these are a subset of the checks that Trimarc performs during an Active Directory security assessment, but we're looking at inactive accounts, which is a combination of password age and user logon age. I know that some organizations are just looking at password age when last password was changed. So say that's supposed to be 90 days. Well, after 90 days, if the person hasn't changed their password, or maybe after 80 days, they go ahead and flag that as inactive, even though the person may be logging on every weekday. So we want to make sure we combine those two and use that information to figure out when an account is inactive. A reversible encryption simply means that if that account is flagged for reversible encryption, then it's stored in a clear text type fashion in the Active Directory database. So instead of having a hash, it'll have a hash, and it will have an encoded or encrypted version of it that can then just be easily reversed, and you can get the plain text password without having to actually hack it or crack it or anything like that. The passwords and the configuration of those, password not required means that this account this account has no password. It was created programmatically, probably, and therefore does not have a password associated with it. So if there was no password that was actually set up and configured, then it's maybe possible to authenticate with that account without a password at all. Password never expires. This means that the password won't expire and will not expire if the account password. So basically, when the account would normally expire, this just means that it won't expire. So this is one of the reasons why we often see that the passwords in the environment are older than they should be. So you don't want to see passwords that have never expired set. DES Kerberos encryption is an older version of Kerberos encryption. AES is the way it should be configured now, and do not require Kerberos pre-authentication. Provides a vulnerable configuration for the account where the account credentials could be identified easily. And SID history is a throwback to domain migration scenarios where you have multiple domains and users want to you're migrating users from an older domain to a newer domain. And the way that works is you have the old domain account and the new domain account, same person. And the old domain account is configured with permissions on, say, home directories and profile paths and things like that. Well, the SID for that account are associated with those locations and provides access. So when you have the new account in the new domain, it has a new SID. So what you would do is take the SID from the old account and add it to the SID history of the new account in that new domain. And that way that new account can still access those resources. What should happen next is that the new account SID should be added to those resources so that the new account can access them natively without requiring SID history. That doesn't always happen. So, and also the SID history is supposed to be cleaned up after that update is performed. SID history tends to stick around. There also is an escalation or persistence method that can be used with SID history where an account can impersonate a privileged account through SID history. So it's definitely something to look at and clean up if it exists. So here's the PowerShell code that we're using to gather this information in the script that, again, we're providing after the webcast. First, we're going to gather the user attributes using the PowerShell command get80user and parse this data for user accounts with potential issues. And when we put it all together, we get a nice little report like this that tells us what they are. The PowerShell script is actually going to export this data to a CSV file, so you can go and look to see what needs to be cleaned up. We're going to show some of these on the screen as well when we run the script. Domain password policy. This determines the minimum length of account passwords, how long until they need to be changed, things like that. The AD default password minimum is 7 characters, and most AD environments we have seen have this set between 8 and 10 characters. Some are 0, some are 3, some are 5. So some are set to other values, which is not appropriate for most environments, because password spraying takes advantage of short passwords. Now, password spraying is just a way to take a list of passwords and attempt using those passwords to authenticate as users in the environment. So a good way to mitigate password spraying is setting the domain password characters to 12 or more. So Tombstone Lifetime is an Active Directory forest setting which controls how long deleted items are stored and replicated in AD. Along with this, it determines how long an Active Directory backup is valid. Originally, this was set to 60 days, meaning that any Active Directory backups you may need to restore from would only be valid for this period of time. We recommend setting this to 180 days, which is the current default and has been since 2003 SP1. Microsoft supported backups update a partition attribute to identify the last backup date for that partition. Not all systems that backup Active Directory set this attribute, since they are most likely not using a Microsoft supported method. So you'll want to check to make sure that your backup dates on these partitions match when your backup system are actually performing backups. But the best way to ensure that you are supported from Microsoft and you have Microsoft support, in other words, if you run into a disaster scenario, is by running a system state backup on at least the FSMA role holders, those domain controllers that hold those roles in the AD forest, at least once a month, preferably a lot more, and keep for at least 6 months. That way you have a good insurance policy in case something bad happens. And then here's the PowerShell code that we're going to use to get the Tombstone Lifetime partition backups. Again, this code is in the Invoke-TrimarcADChecks PowerShell script we're providing after the webcast. But this is just an example of what the code looks like and what the result is when you run it. I identified that when you run and create install from media set, it will actually set this backup date to be the date and time of that IFM run. So that might throw off your backup dates a little bit, depending on how often you're creating those to spin up new DCs. So the Active Directory forest is the security boundary for Active Directory. This changes when you trust other forests, since you're expanding the authentication boundary for Active Directory. This means that the trust should be reviewed at least annually to ensure they're still required. Bidirectional trust should be scrutinized to ensure they need to be these two-way trust configuration. And ultimately, if trusts are required, selective authentication can improve the security of the trust. This changes the default behavior from allow any user across the trust to see everything to users require explicit approval to access resources. Otherwise, they can't view or access anything across the trust. So the key takeaway here is identify the trust and the trust configuration. Understand that credentials could potentially be captured or lost by someone connecting over that trust, be that to an application that is caching it on the other side, or something like RDP in order to perform administration across that trust. When someone performs that RDP authentication and logon, their credentials are typically stored on the other side on that system that they connect to. So again, here's the PowerShell code to gather and display the trust information. This makes it pretty easy using the get 80 trust PowerShell commandlet. And then we can show some of the information about that trust. So with Active Directory and Kerberos authentication, there is a concept of a service principal name, or SPN. We can use the set SPN command in order to discover any of the duplicate SPNs in the forest. The issue is that this SPN is effectively a signpost that points to a service account. So when a user needs to connect to a service or a resource or an application, they're going to ask for the service account associated with that SPN. If that service account has if the multiple service accounts have the same SPN configured, the domain controller is not going to know which account it's supposed to use. So here we can see that there's a SPN configured for a Microsoft SQL server, and the service account the SPN is associated with two different service accounts, actually two service accounts, one in each domain that we see here. So that'll need to be cleaned up, because that means that any connection that's going to the SQL server is actually going to fall back to NTLM, because Kerberos is not going to work. And that kadmin change PWD we see that is registered on the KERBTTD accounts, that's fine. So definitely clean up any of these duplicate SPNs that are identified. Group Policy Preferences was released in the 2008 timeframe and included capability to provide and update credentials. These credentials were encrypted using AES 256, which sounds great until you realize that a static key was used to encrypt them. So there's a C password value in the group policy preference XML files, and that C password value is the encrypted password. Using a PowerShell function from PowerSploit, we can reverse this encryption and get the plain text value. And since authenticated users have read access to group policies in the sysvol share on all domain controllers, anyone can view this information and get the password stored in group policy preference XML files, even across trusts. This is less of an issue now that Microsoft has released a patch preventing the use of group policy preference passwords, but old GPOs with these credentials remain in the environment, and Trimarc has identified a few in the past year during Active Directory security assessments that would lead to either full AD compromise or compromising sensitive server data. So you definitely want to check this and make sure that there are none of these lingering, and if there are, clean them up and remove them. So we call Active Directory admins, or AD admins, as the primary privileged AD accounts. So these include domain admins, enterprise admins, members of the domain administrators group, things like that. And we can get this information by running get 80 group member against the administrators group for the domain with a recursive flag, and this will loop through all the members and any groups that are members and members of those groups. So the AD admins are accounts that have full AD rights, and these require careful protection. So we want to make sure that these passwords change regularly, preferably every year or when someone leaves, that we disable any inactive accounts that are there that we identify, and then eventually remove these disabled accounts so they don't linger around, because if they're re-enabled, who knows who has control of them at that point. That there's no SPNs, Kerberos service principal names, on accounts associated with people because of Kerberosing risk, and no computer accounts, because we don't want to be in a situation where someone compromises a single computer and ultimately compromises Active Directory. And then any service accounts that are in these groups, we want to identify what they do, where do they run. So are they configured to run a service on a specific server? Well, we want to make sure that that server is well protected from compromise, because compromise of that server would result in compromise of Active Directory through that service account. What computers these authenticate to? So thinking about vulnerability scanning accounts. If it's a member of domain admins and is scanning everything, that could be a problem. But ultimately, what rights are really required for these accounts? And identify if they really need to be in this group. That's part of what we do is when we perform our Active Directory security assessments is identifying the service accounts, looking at what they are, and then providing recommendations around should they be there, how they could be configured otherwise, and we have a few case studies on how to reduce that. So here's the PowerShell code and the results. What we're doing is getting the recursive membership of the domain administrators group, which includes all the members of the member groups, and then loop through them and get more detail about each of those members. We can see here this is a group managed service account, which is the same one I talked about in the last webcast. But also, we want to look and identify the protected users group. So this is a new group that was created when the domain PDC emulator is running server 2012 R2. Note that the full protection of protected users group at the domain level is only available when the domain functional level is 2012 R2. So we recommend all AD admin accounts are added to protected users group. There's a number of protections that come with this group just by adding accounts to it. We can see the AD admins group on the left side there, and then the domain protected users group membership on the right side. And we can see none of our AD admins are in the protected users group. So this is going to provide some additional authentication protections. But one of the best things about this is it's going to prevent Kerberos delegation from occurring for these accounts, as well as making sure that the account credentials aren't cached and limiting the Kerberos TGT, the ticket granting ticket lifetime to 4 hours. This way, any group membership is forced to change after 4 hours. One of the key things to look at is making sure that any of the AD admins aren't sitting around with old passwords. So we want to look at these passwords, make sure that they're changing at least annually, because the older passwords are typically poor and easier to guess. Password spraying and Kerberosing are popular attack methods for compromising these accounts with older or poor passwords. In my lab, they don't have very old dates, so I'm just going to show an example. Because using the information from PowerShell, we can build a table in Excel, and this is an adjusted version similar to what we find in customer environments during Active Directory security assessments. So looking at those that are very old, this default administrator account is about 15 years old or over 15 years at this point. Should be changed, hasn't been changed, still enabled, so that's risk. And then we have a couple of service accounts here with old passwords as well. And then, as I mentioned, the Kerberos service principal name or SPN is effectively the signpost. And again, this points from the service count for a server, points to the service count associated with a service on a server that supports Kerberos authentication. So when a client needs to connect to the service, it's got to request the Kerberos service ticket from a domain controller. And in order to do this, it needs to provide a SPN for that service. The DC looks up the account in the AD forest that has the SPN, identifies the account, and uses the account's password data to encrypt the ticket. Once the service ticket is delivered to the service, it attempts to open the service ticket, and if it can assume that the DC provided it, so it validates access for the user. Kerberosing, which was developed by Tim Medine in 2014, requests service tickets, usually RC4 encrypted, for target service accounts and saves them to attempt offline brute password forcing or hybrid password attempts. So once the attacker can open this Kerberos service ticket, they have successfully guessed the account password. This is a really big deal, and I've talked about this for a number of years. The importance of ensuring that the AD admin accounts don't have SPNs and service accounts needing long passwords. And this is, like I said, this has been an issue since Tim released his Kerberos tool at DerbyCon in 2014. Well, this really shifted the attack of service accounts with old passwords from hypothetical to practical. And many attackers use this method now. So it's really important to check accounts that are highly privileged, that have service principal names, and especially those that have old passwords. I published Kerberosing detection with 100% accuracy, no false positives, a while back on the Trimarc website. So go ahead and check that out. So we also want to check the default domain administrator account for issues. Is this account enabled? Is the password changed? Does it have a SPN? Because ultimately the domain administrator account should only be used when the other AD admin accounts are inaccessible. Should not be logged onto. There should be loud alerting for it when it does. And this account should never have a SPN, since that means it was being used as a service account for service on a server on the network. And we don't want that, because that would mean that if you compromise the server you could compromise AD. or a Kerberos, the domain administrator account, and get that password to compromise AD. And if this account is disabled, great, but make sure you're monitoring it for it in case it was re-enabled, so that if it is re-enabled, then you get an alert on that. In the meantime, make sure the password changes about every year and that it has no spin associated. So we can also create an array of the default built-in common groups that are privileged in AD and loop through these to get the group membership. So this is what's in the PowerShell script that we'll provide after the webcast. Here's the looping code, which gets the group membership and counts the members. And the following slides that I'm about to show you will show the output for some of these groups. The PowerShell script will show an error if it can't enumerate the group, which is usually because it doesn't exist in that environment, that domain, or is inaccessible. An example of this is the domain that I'm targeting is a child domain, so it's not going to have the enterprise admins group or the schema admins group. And note that this membership enumeration is not recursive, so any groups listed in these groups need to be enumerated separately. You can just add them to the array that I showed in the previous slide. So the default AD groups, administrators, full AD admin rights for the domain, and full domain controller admin rights for the domain. So we want to look at these members and make sure that these make sense. We have a GMSA that's part of this group that probably doesn't make sense. There's a server admins-DCs group that may or may not be appropriate, so we want to check the membership of that separately. Note that since this is the administrators group, when we do that recursive check that I mentioned earlier, it will show all the accounts that are in that group. Domain administrators, it gets most of its rights, or domain admins, it gets its rights through being member of the domain administrators group. And so this means full AD admin rights for the domain, full DC admin rights for the domain, default rights on all domain group policies, and default local administrator on all domain joined computers. So we have seen customers that have removed domain admins from the administrators group, which effectively removes a lot of those rights. They also made sure that it was not local administrator on the domain joined computers, which happens by default. And then the other part is that the issue is that the default rights on the domain group policies are still there. So this means that domain admins, even if you remove it from administrators, still has control over the group policies linked to the domain, within the domain, and the domain controllers are you. This could be problematic because you could compromise an account that was a domain admin's, even if it wasn't a member of administrators, it could still modify those group policies. So enterprise admins, this is the group that one of the groups that is only in the domain root for the Active Directory forest. Membership in it has membership in every domain's administrators group, which provides most of the rights. So that means it's an Active Directory admin in every forest domain, a domain controller admin in every forest domain, has default rights on all of the domain group policies as well. And so this group should remain empty in a single domain forest, and membership should be very limited in a multi-domain forest. Here we can see there's a VMware admin group in this, which doesn't make sense at all, so that definitely should be removed. And then the other forest domain group is going to be schema admins. This is the only group that can modify the AD schema, and it should remain empty until schema actually needs updating. And why there's an SCCM account in here doesn't make sense. That should be removed. So this is a good reason because to review this, because it could have been added a while back. There might have been a mistake or something along those lines. So we want to make sure that that gets cleaned up. And then there's the server operators group, which is one of those groups that have been carried over from the NT4 days. This has a lot of default rights on domain controllers defined through user rights assignments. So the ability to log on locally, create and delete shared resources, start and stop services, backup and restore files on an Active Directory domain controller. That's a pretty heavy right. Format the hard disk, shut down the computer. No default members, and we see this as effectively a domain controller admin group. So a member of this group should be really well and tightly scrutinized at a similar level to domain admins or administrators. So we want to check that and make sure that that makes sense. Ultimately, it's better to just delegate rights around what's required. But sometimes organizations think that server operators is related to servers in the organization, in the domain, and not specific to domain controllers, which it is. Then we have account operators, which effectively has like a backdoor access to a lot of the security principles in the Active Directory domain. So users, groups, computers, has no default members, should remain empty. And Microsoft even says that this is a service administrator group because it can modify server operators. Keep it empty and do not use for delegated administration. So you should not have any members of account operators in any domain. Much better to delegate out those rights. Then one of the interesting things we see in a lot of organizations, those using VMware, is we find a group called VMware admins. And this VMware admins Active Directory group has full VMware rights on the VMware infrastructure. And so what's interesting about this is these same environments that have VMware have virtual domain controllers. So this means if I can identify a VMware admin account in Active Directory, it's probably just a regular user account. And looking at the output below, we see that there's a number of user accounts here in a number of different cities. So if we can compromise any of these user accounts, we can compromise VMware, which means that we have access, admin right, root level access to all the VMs on this VMware platform, which includes the virtual domain controllers, which means we can copy off the domain controller storage. We can probably run commands within the VMware environment and effectively compromise the domain controller. So you want to make sure that the VMware administrators are providing or following best practices around privileged accounts, so separate admin accounts, using admin workstations, the passwords change regularly, and isolate and protect those accounts as best as possible. The KERB-TGT account is the domain service account and is used for encrypting and signing Kerberos tickets by domain controllers. This password is set when it's created and practically never changes. The issue is that if an attacker is able to gain knowledge of the KERB-TGT account password, whether the current one or the previous one, they are able to create what are called golden tickets. Golden tickets are Kerberos tickets that are basically created and forged in order to spoof access to whatever the attacker wants to. The domain controller and Active Directory backups contain this password. There's a number of different ways an attacker could gain knowledge of this password. So you want to make sure that you have a process to change this password at least twice every year because it stores the current and previous password. Both of those are valid. And it is a U.S. Department of Defense STIG requirement to change this twice a year. Microsoft also recommends changing this proactively. So in Kerberos, there's the concept of a double hop. This is because when the user gets a service ticket for the web server, they provide that service ticket to the web server. They have authenticated themselves to the web server. When the web server needs to perform whatever updates that the user has performed within the web application, the web server isn't able to just tell the database server this is the user that wants to make these updates or has performed these updates in the application server. So we have this double hop issue where the user's Kerberos ticket is not going to jump to the second hop or to that next server. The way to solve this is by using Kerberos delegation. Delegation enables the web server to impersonate the user to the database server in order to perform the updates the user requested. And so Microsoft originally had unconstrained delegation, which is the most broad and insecure because ultimately anyone with unconstrained delegation, anyone who authenticates to a server or service that has this, that server or service receives the user TGT. That is their Kerberos proof of identity on the network. And then that service or server can use that TGT to connect any Kerberos service on the network and impersonate that user to any environment or any service that's running Kerberos. In the instance of the vulnerability scanning account I mentioned earlier that might be in domain admins, when that scans a server that is configured with unconstrained delegation, guess what happens? If it's using Kerberos to do that scan, that Kerberos TGT is left behind on that server because that server is allowed to do unconstrained delegation. So it's stored in LSASS and can be used and extracted by an attacker who compromises that server. So vulnerability scanning counts should be split off into separate tiers in order to limit the impact of this. But also an admin could be tricked into connecting to a server with unconstrained delegation and then lose their TGT. That's why it's important to use a protected users group, or at least check the box that says this account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. Constrained delegation improves this a little bit, or actually quite a bit, by saying that this user or this service account is allowed to delegate through Kerberos to these specific services on these servers in order to impersonate the user to those. And then constrain with protocol transition allows the service that has this configured to impersonate any user to specific Kerberos services. I call this Kerberos magic because basically there is no proof of authentication that has already occurred. So the service or service account configured with this Kerberos delegation can just snap its fingers and effectively get a Kerberos delegation ticket. Again, it'd be limited to the specific services configured for that system, but still something that should be looked at and reviewed. Resource-based constrained delegation reverses this whole flow from this service is allowed to connect to this other one. Now the resource itself, so the backend database server, would be the one that identifies what can delegate to it. So I cover this really quickly. There's a lot of good information about attacks that have been performed or configured about Kerberos delegation. I talked about unconstrained delegation, Kerberos attacks back at Black Hat in 2015, and there's been a lot of work since then, especially by some of the SpectreOps folks and some others, in order to talk about what the dangers are and what the risks are. So definitely, you really want to protect any system or reduce Kerberos delegation where possible. Make sure that you have your AD admin accounts that's accounts as sensitive and cannot be delegated, or add them to protected users group. You want to convert unconstrained delegation to constrained. That will limit the impact of unconstrained delegation attacks. Certainly by removing it, they would be gone. One of the big ones that came out within the past couple of years was unconstrained delegation in the Active Directory forest and the printer spooler service running on domain controllers. That's something we check for as part of our Active Directory security assessment. If you have unconstrained delegation, the easier mitigation of that, outside of obviously converting from unconstrained to constrained, is stopping the spooler service on all your domain controllers. That will stop that type of attack until you can get all your unconstrained delegation systems converted over, if possible. We want to make sure that service accounts with Kerberos delegation have long, complex passwords, preferably group managed service accounts. Again, remove delegation that don't, from systems that don't require it, and never use domain controller spins when delegating. We want to work to remove Kerberos delegation from all the accounts that don't have it or don't require it, especially those without spins, and work to shift accounts with unconstrained delegation to delegation, as I mentioned, or constrained, and we want to limit that. So here's some code that can pull that information. It's a little complicated because we've got to look at user account control and do some special checks against the user account control, look at the primary group IDs to filter out domain controllers and read-only domain controllers, and then we look at a specific attribute for resource-based constrained delegation. Once we grab this information, then we can get a nice output like this, so we can identify what the accounts are, what the delegation type is, the account name itself, and the service principal name associated with it. There's a bunch more data around what the configuration is, constrained delegation, things like that. All of that gets exported to a CSV file for review by the Invoke-TrimarcADChecks PowerShell script, which I'll release later. And then for group policy, probably the best way to do this is to open up group policy management, click on group policy objects, and identify who the owners are. It should always be enterprise admins or domain admins. When someone creates a new group policy, sometimes they will be set as the owner, so you want to make sure that gets set back to domain admins or enterprise admins, because even if that person or that account that created that group policy is removed from a group that gives it the ability to create group policy, it will retain the ability to modify it, especially if they're still an owner, which leads me to reviewing group policy delegation. So especially for those group policies that's linked to the domain and domain controllers OU, you want to check to see what the delegation is by clicking through each of those group policies, clicking on delegation tab, and then looking for things that are non-default. So domain admins, enterprise domain controllers and systems should have privilege rights. But authenticated users should only have read, not modify or edit settings. That would be bad. We have seen that. And then anything else that's left, like as we can see here, the server administrators group, there's a server admins group in 2 different domains that have the ability to modify this group policy, which could lead to compromise of Active Directory because they have the ability to modify the default domain controllers policy GPO. So clean that up, make sure that anything, no account that is that should have, or any account that is not an AD admin, that make sure that those accounts don't have rights to modify group policies, especially at the domain and the domain controller levels. And then the domain permissions themselves, this is where we find a number of issues. So again, we have PowerShell code here that will pull this information, export it to a CSV. We can open up that CSV within Excel, and then we can filter it. So here I filtered on the identity reference tab or field, and I filtered out domain admins and administrators. Obviously, I missed enterprise admins. And then for Active Directory rights, I'm looking at anything that's right star effectively. So if it contains right, if it's generic, if it contains generic all, if it contains extended rights, those are the ones I want to look at primarily and first. And then we can filter down a little bit and target some of these. So here I can see there's an MSOL account, which is likely an Azure AD Connect account. It has DS replication get changes and DS replication get changes all rights. These are what is required in order to do password hash sync for Azure AD Connect, so that makes sense. There is this other one called AADC_SVC. Not sure why those have those two rights, but these rights combined provide the ability to perform DC sync through Mimikatz because they have access to the password hash. So if I can compromise an account that has these rights, I can then pull the password hash for any account in the domain that I want to, including the highly privileged domain admin accounts or the KERB-TDT account. So we want to protect those accounts and make sure that a configuration is appropriate. If these are both Azure AD Connect accounts, then probably one of them should be disabled, maybe the AADC_SVC account. Or if this was a SharePoint account, it shouldn't need both of these rights. If we remove get changes all, then it won't have the rights to pull the password hashes, which can just monitor the changes within Active Directory, which is some SharePoint profile services do need. And then at the bottom, we have this weird generic all set for all, and this is for domain computers. This is really bad. We did find this in one environment. There's no reason for domain computers to have full control, which is what generic all means at the domain level. Certainly not for anything, and in this case, it's for all objects. So that can be removed without any issue. There are some exchange rights that need to be reviewed as well. Exchange should not have right DACL at the domain root. We have an article on TrimarcSecurity.com that talks about how to reduce those rights that Exchange has by default. In this lab environment, I don't have Exchange, so can't show that. But this is how you can kind of walk through and look at some of these improper domain permissions. We do a full comprehensive review of all permissions at the domain, the GPO, and the top level OUs and some of the others, especially those admin OUs, as part of our full Active Directory security assessment. So go ahead and do this yourself. If you run into issues, we can certainly perform an assessment for you and then dig into and provide some detailed recommendations around it. So the operating system version of the domain controller does affect the security of Active Directory. So I'm showing here the different levels, different security improvements that come with the Windows OS versions. So once you get Windows Server 2008 R2, this is what the DCs have available to them in Active Directory. Server 2012, 2012 R2, and Server 2016. So a number of these occur when you upgrade to this version of the Windows operating system on the domain controller. Some of them have to be enabled, like the recycle bin, and then others you get as part of getting the domain functional level up to that level or version. I'm not going to go through all these, just the slide is there as a reference, because we're going to talk now about domain controllers running old versions. So the DCs must be running Microsoft supported Windows versions. So that would be 2012 R2 at this point. You can run all Windows Server 2012 R2 domain controllers, even with older Windows Server versions in the domain. So if you have 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, all these server OSs in your environment running on your servers, that's fine. There shouldn't be any issue with that. If you have 2003, you have Windows XP, you'll want to do some testing, especially around SMB configuration, because those need SMB v1, and newer versions of Windows OS, such as 2019, actually have SMB v1 disabled by default. So you'll want to do some testing with 2003 and Windows XP in the environment, but getting the domain controllers up to these levels shouldn't affect anything overall. All the domain controllers should be running a minimum of Server 2012 R2. As I said, that's the latest supported version, but preferably 2016 and 2019. There are a number of under-the-cover security improvements that occurred in these versions of Windows that really protect against some of the standard recon that happen in environments. And I want to note that I mentioned earlier, if all your domain controllers are not running 2012 R2 with the 2012 R2 domain functional level, the protected users group doesn't have full domain protection. So it's a really good reason to get up to that version. So let's look at the quick and simple code to look at this. We can use the Active Directory PowerShell commandlet get 80 domain controller. Filter star will get us all of those. And then we can select the host name and operating system so we can see those very quickly and easily. Obviously in this domain I have one, it's running 2019, so that's not a big deal. But if it was running 2008 or 2008 R2, I might want to look at that, make sure that's fully patched, make sure that I'm running at the correct domain functional level. I'm not still running at 2003, for example. While forest and domain functional levels have less emphasis in recent versions, it is important to make sure that these match the DC version, especially when you're at 2012 R2 or 2016. There are some improvements that occur there. You want to wait until after all the DCs and the 80 forest are running the same version and give it some time to bake. And then same thing with checking these PowerShell code, very short and quick and easy. We also want to make sure that we're checking the domain controller GPO config, very much like we are, as I mentioned earlier. And we don't want to link server GPOs to domain controllers because that can cause unintended consequences. Domain controller GPOs should have their own, our domain controllers should have their own specific GPOs just for domain controllers. We also want to review the advanced audit policy for domain controllers. So find the GPOs that are linked to the DCs, the DCOU, and that see what those audit policies are. If there's also a standard audit policy, we want to make sure we enable this setting here, so that way the advanced audit policy configuration will override the standard policy. If this is not set to enabled, then your standard audit policy is what you're getting. We have some extensive reviews around that in our ADSA as well. You also want to look at your domain controller user rights assignments across your GPOs. These are the core focus for those, and make sure that that you review these, figure out what's there. The defaults don't always make sense. So we want to reduce the rights and make sure that it's pretty much just administrators. So I'm showing here what those are and what they should be. So add workstations to the domain, only 80 admins, specific groups or accounts that need to add workstations to the domain have that right. Allow logon locally, allow logon through terminal services. By default, server operators, print operators have this right. That may not be appropriate in your environment. I don't think print operators should have any rights, so you want to remove all those, especially when it comes to loading and unloading device drivers, because that could compromise the domain controller. Make sure that those are removed. Manage auditing security log can clear the security logs, so we want to make sure that those are limited. Take ownership of files or other objects. You can become the owner of an AD object, so only AD admins should have this right. And I talked quite a bit about Kerberos delegation, so only AD admins should be able to configure that as well. Now, there are some tools that you can use for reviewing Active Directory. The first I'm going to mention is Pingcastle. Go ahead and check it out at pingcastle.com. And then I went and did some quick searching to see what I could find, and looking through Twitter recommendations or tweets, I found there's also AD Collector, which can enumerate and gather some data, and AD Recon, which I believe has been around for a little while, so you can check that out as well. I have not evaluated these. This is not Trimarc endorsing these tools. This is just providing some information about what tools are out there and could be available for you. And of course, as I mentioned, we're providing a free PowerShell script called Invoke-TrimarcADChecks. This is developed based on our AD security assessment engagement focus and has some key AD security items that we identify in the domain. We'll be releasing this with the slides and the recording in the next couple days, and we'll have a blog post that explains eventually what it is, what it covers, what things to look at, as well as a link to the PowerShell script. So I'm going to show you a quick demo of what it looks like, and then we'll wrap up and go through Q&A. So you just start it by running it. You can target the domain, or it's going to discover the local domain. It's going to go through and run and cover all those things that I mentioned. Note the warning errors. this is a child domain, so it doesn't have the enterprise admins group, it doesn't have the schema admins group, but it's going to go through and it's going to identify that it ran in this environment 8 seconds. There's a log file, which is the transcript file, which you can go and review, and then the data files that are generated and saved to CTEMP Trimarc 80-80 reports by default, so you can go and look at that. You can change that to be whatever location you want. This does require being run on Windows 10 or Server 2016, PowerShell 5 or newer, and the Active Directory PowerShell commandlets. So, in conclusion, you can check many key AD security areas yourself. We're providing a free PowerShell tool that can help you do this. There is no support with it, but we are providing it for free so you can use it. This Active Directory Security Review requires review of a number of different key areas, which we've talked about during this presentation. And you can do this yourself, or of course you can reach out to us at Trimarc to help you out with that. Slides and video and PowerShell will be at this link at the bottom after in the next couple of days. We will tweet out from the Trimarc account when those are available. And remember that we have a webcast coming up in July 15th, and I'm going to be talking about how to best protect Active Directory administration. So I'm going to switch over to question and answer, and I'm going to look at the ones that are most liked at this point. So let's take a look at that. And I also want to say thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate everyone who joined this webcast, taking an hour out of your time. So let's see. All right, I'm looking at the most liked ones, and I'm going to start with those. So, is there any potential negative impact to adding AD admins to the protected users group? Great question. So I know of 2 instances where it did cause problems. You want to use your administrators group, your default domain administrator account, sorry, as your emergency account. So don't add that to protected users group. You have that as a backup. The only time that I've seen an issue with this is if an AD admin account is used for other types of administration outside of Active Directory, it does not provide delegation. So, for example, SharePoint administration may break. So that's one instance where it may not work. But the one that I'm aware of is a customer that had effectively a farm of admin servers, and they were using a DNS round robin approach, or a single DNS name for those servers behind it. And so when the AD admins were connecting, RDPing into that server pool effectively through that DNS name, once they were protected, a member of protected users, they could not do that because NTLM is not allowed. And Kerberos obviously wouldn't work because that single name isn't actually the name of the server behind that DNS name. So that was broken. So that would be the big reason why it wouldn't work. But the protections are helpful because at a minimum, Kerberos delegation is not going to work anymore. So that's a very good reason to make sure that they're a member of protected users. Let's see, how do you contend with cleaning up service accounts when it's unknown what some of them are being used for? This is a great question, and we do run into this from time to time. The question that we have for our customer that has a service account, it's say a member of domain admins, and they're not really sure what it's for. Our primary question is, can this application be fully supported if all the components of it are not well known? We have customers that have tried what has been called the screen test, which is you disable that account on a Friday afternoon and see what happens. That's probably the more extreme way to do it. And if someone screams, then you know that it's broken something. But realistically, you're going to look at your SIM. You're going to figure out where that account is logging on. You can check your last logon date. There are a couple of tools that will scan the domain controllers and figure out where that account is logging on. Oftentimes that's used to determine when an account is locking out. But looking at the logs in the SIM is going to give you a good idea of where that account is being used, what it's being used for. If it has a service principal name, which it probably does, if it's a service account, that will usually point you to the server that it's potentially running a service on. So you can go and check that. If the computer account listed in the service principal name is not in AD anymore or isn't working anymore, then it may not be in use anymore. And then you can do that, disable the account and see what happens. Great question. Do you need domain admin rights to run the scripts that will be provided later? No, you do not. All of these these are based on the Active Directory PowerShell commandlets that Microsoft has provided for years. You can just be a regular user. In fact, we do a version of this when we do an Active Directory security assessment, obviously much larger and much more comprehensive, but we only ever operate as a user when we are doing assessments, because our goal is to show you what an attacker could gain just with that information. So no, you just need a regular user account. Now, if the environment has been locked down, then there are certain things that you may not be able to see, but generally speaking, the lab that I ran this in is default, just as a user. So you don't need to be or have any special rights in order to run it. What pitfalls, if any, have you seen when Labs has been deployed on a large scale? Good question. So we've seen customers up to 120, 130,000 users deploy Labs across all their workstations, and management of that. I'd say the biggest pitfall from what we've seen when we do security assessments comes around the delegation of Labs, and certainly that's one of the biggest challenges. So you can deploy Labs pretty easily, but getting the delegation right as far as who should have the ability to view the Labs password, that local admin password that's configured by Labs on that system. There's the challenge with Labs, I would say not so much a concern, but a challenge is that once someone has viewed the password, there's no automated method to then change it. So they would have knowledge of that password for that specific computer until it gets changed again. Certainly you can put in the process to ensure that they go and clear the time attribute associated with Labs. So then the Labs client-side component as part of the GPO refresh will then reach out and update that password. But you can also monitor for Labs auditing and see when someone has accessed that attribute, so that can be kind of figured out. We do dive into Labs pretty extensively as part of our AD security assessment. So let's see. All right. When creating a service account for a vulnerability scanning tool such as Nexpose, Nessus, etc., what permission should you assign that account in order to execute proper credential scans on the systems? This is a good question, and this can get challenging because some of the vulnerability scanning systems can use an agent, and there's been this agent versus agentless debate for, I don't know, as long as I've been working in IT, I think. And we seem to go through cycles where we have agents, and then we end up with 30 agents on our boxes, and then we switch back and go agentless, and then in which case agentless is using credentials to scan them. Our standard recommendation when we perform Active Directory security assessments is for vulnerability scanning accounts, break them into 3 tiers. You want to have 3 accounts, basically. One specific to workstations, one specific to servers, and one specific for domain controllers. And that way the scans can be broken out and use only the credentials for those so-called tiers. If your vulnerability scanning tool cannot do this, cannot be broken out in this manner, please talk to them and ask them and put in a request for it to be done. If everyone does this, then they will actually implement this configuration and improve the security. And if they say that they shouldn't have to do that, or that's not something that should be necessary, please send them my way. I would love to have a conversation with someone at any security scanning company that doesn't feel like this is important, and I would love to have that conversation to explain why it's important. In at least one instance, Trimarc has been able to get a vendor to change their policy as far as, or their documentation around what rights were required for their service account. So I'm happy to have that conversation and help make that change. So insofar as the vulnerability scanning accounts, typically they do need local admin rights in order to do a number of the things that they're scanning for, so you're not really going to get around that. They are often going to say domain admins is what's required because that makes it easy for everything to work. Domain admins puts your environment at risk. As soon as you put that credential into that tool, any manager of that tool or anyone with admin rights to that tool could potentially extract that, in addition to the attacker vulnerability of unconstrained delegation, or even if the security scanning tool just hiccups and leaves behind a credential, which has happened before. Another system that has issues with this, as I understand it, are software inventorying tools. These often need some sort of rights, and some do some fairly sketchy things, such as dropping a file and then running that file and executing it on there, and then just executing the file that's already exists without checking for a signature or things like that. So you really want to have good understanding of how these tools work and what they're doing. Certainly any scanning tool, be it vulnerability scanning or inventory or anything like that, you don't want to just put it in domain admins. You want to have a good idea of what it's for, where it's going, and then test it in a lab. Look to see what logon events happen. This is a 4624 event, and the logon types. So you can see if it's just a network logon where the credential is not passed forward, or if it's in they use some sort of interactive logon or some other where the credential is left behind. All right, thank you. Good question. What are some of the common issues with implementing protected users? I talked about that already. So yeah, it's pretty much comes down to some unusual or custom configurations where there's some name resolution tricks in order to connect to servers. So the solution for that company was basically to use the real name of the server, and everyone had to know when that server changed to use that real name, or they adjusted the way that they had the pool set up. Let's see, do you have any recommendations for building an AD lab to learn and practice the misconfiguration scenarios described in the presentation, looking for guidance on how many DCs, child domains, server types, workstations, versions, etc. Also in your lab, do you use SIM, EDR, AV, firewalls, and any other security products to understand the monitoring side of any malicious actions taken? This is an excellent question. I do see this question frequently on Twitter. There are a number of great projects out there. You definitely want to look at Detection Lab, which is done by Chris Long, which is exceptional. This is basically a bunch of scripts that spin up an AD lab with a configuration and monitoring and ways to run attack tools against it to see what that looks like. It's probably the most complete version of that. Jared Haidt has also provided some scripts that you can use to spin up a lab in Azure in order to look at AD and have that configured. And there's a number of different projects that are out there that make it easier to spin up a lab and have it there. I would say for most of our labs, at least most of the labs that I use, I try to keep it down to 1, maybe 2 domain controllers. That way I don't tend to have replication issues. I like to have a couple of different domains in there, nothing too fancy. And then as far as servers and workstations, I'd say server types, you probably want to do 2008 R2, 2012 R2. Those are the most common that you're going to see. Domain controllers are different versions, so that way you see the different domain functional levels. You can download from Microsoft the ISO to install these server versions. They're time limited, but you can rearm them. I think the switch is actually rearm, so you can use them up to, I believe it's 6 months, and then after that you'd have to reinstall. But if you're like me, you probably have destroyed your lab by after 6 months and need to rebuild it anyway. There are some scripts that can build out usernames. I have a custom one that I built that I call Invoke-TrimarcADChecks, so it's my chaos monkey of sorts that we use for the Trimarc labs that builds out a lot of these configurations that are known bad that we've seen. That's not something we're planning to make public right now, but maybe in the future we could look at that. But yeah, I'll probably tweet out some additional recommendations or guidance around labs later today or tomorrow. Let's see, have you seen anyone implement and manage selective authentication well? Are there tools that can be used to help manage it? My understanding is that it's effective for limiting access, but very difficult to manage. That's a great point. It is difficult to manage, especially if you already have a trust in place. You are probably not going to go back and change it to selective auth. I would say for a scenario where you need to allow a specific group in a domain access to a specific server in another domain, for that limited use case, that is the perfect reason for using selective authentication. The issue that I've seen with trusts is that a lot of organizations through mergers, acquisitions, they acquire a new company, they just set up a trust through AD, do a couple of onboarding, and then call it a day, with the goal that they are going to migrate everything over into their environment eventually. This usually doesn't happen. And then you get companies with 100 forests that have trust with each other because of the companies that have been acquired. The best ones I've seen, actually the best one I've seen is a large multinational company out of Germany. They have had a policy that there will be no trust with any forest, even mergers, acquisitions, any reason. They do everything without doing trusts. So obviously they're not doing migrations. They've been doing this for, I'd say, 15 years or more, and they've been very successful. They're a very good-sized, fairly large company out of Europe. So it can be done. The problem with trust, like I said, is that they just sprawl and they just continue and they don't really go anywhere. Selective authentication is a good security method, but since you have to provide explicit access, it does take a while. And you're right, the resources aren't great around it. But if you are a security person or even an AD person and you've been asked to set up a trust, definitely look at selective authentication, make sure the use cases are there. I would say that any modern organization should have a trust request form for any new trust, which defines what it's being used for, the specific use cases in a couple scenarios, and then the policy that it gets reviewed on an annual basis to ensure that it's still required. Because once you expand that forest through a trust, you are expanding the accessibility of it, which can be dangerous. So let's see, is the KERB-TDT account truly needed or can that be disabled? Well, the KERB-TDT account is disabled, so that's handled for you, but it is truly needed. It's not used for anything. It doesn't authenticate, it doesn't log on anywhere, it's not a service account really, but the domain controllers use this account in order to sign all Kerberos tickets, specifically the PAC, which is the privilege attribute, the component within the Kerberos tickets, the service tickets, and the TGT, and encrypting the TGT itself so no one can see inside of it except for the domain controller. So it is actually used. It is important. The password does need to be changed twice every year. And again, Microsoft recommends that be done proactively. Is there any way to link two accounts belonging to one human in AD without an external database? Sure. We've seen some creative methods have done this way. The obvious one is that you have a user account, which would be, I don't know, first initial, last name, and then the admin account is ADM or admin dash in that same format. That would be a quick and easy way to link them together. I have seen that others have used a numbering system instead. So the name of your account isn't actually anything to do with your name, it's just a number. And then for the admin account, it's an AD or ADM dash that number. So that links them together. You could also identify one of the custom attributes that Exchange adds, or reuse one of the other attributes on the accounts in Active Directory that aren't being used. There are a lot that are there. And basically set up a backlink system, but nothing automatic to do that. In other words, so it would be something that you would manually have to do as part of or set it up as part of your provisioning process. So let's see. These are good questions. I appreciate the questions, and like I said, I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer to go through them. If you're happy to stay on to hear me talk about them. All right. Are there any vulnerability scanners that support lapse instead of tossing around DA highly privileged credentials willy-nilly to entire subnets? Thanks, Jeff, and I appreciate the use of willy-nilly. I don't think that willy-nilly is used often enough. So not to my knowledge, there aren't any vulnerability scanners that support lapse. I think they absolutely could. They could be configured to reach out to that attribute on that computer, look up the password, use that to authenticate, and then clear that timestamp on the lapse attribute on that computer account. The thing that I've seen though is support for password vaults like CyberArk, where basically they programmatically reach out to something like CyberArk or maybe Secret Server, get the password for the account through the vault, reach out, go ahead and do the scan, and then basically check it back in through the API. But nothing that I'm aware of for lapse. I think that'd be great. All right. Do you recommend folks implement SACLs for various AD objects? And there's a link here talking about auditing configuration. To an extent. So I did a DerbyCon talk last year that talked about ways that you could effectively audit for things like Bloodhound use, audit for enumerating domain admin group membership. If I have time, I'll cover this in my July talk. But I also talked about ways you could effectively cloak AD so no one could see it, and some other interesting things. I'll probably do an advanced AD security webcast in the future and cover those topics again as well. But yeah, from a perspective of auditing and getting some better auditing around what's happening, you can definitely implement SACLs, which are effectively auditing ACLs for objects in Active Directory. One of the easier ways to do that is to set an auditing flag for on the admin SD holder objects. So that way, anyone who connects and views any of those objects, you'd get an event ID that triggers an Active Directory on the domain controller. And then you could pull that into your SIM and check for that. So you'd filter out those accounts that you would know that would be doing this, such as any kind of auditing account or scripted account that is going through and checking the membership. And then anything else would be something that would be unusual for sure. How do we safely convert new SIDs to replace the SID history of those accounts? Good question. So if your migration is done and that domain that you've migrated through is gone, then you can safely remove those SIDs and SID history associated with that domain. So a SID is created by taking the domain SID, and then to the end of that, you're going to add a dash and then the RID that's associated with that account. Effectively, there's a RID master in the FSMO roles for the domain that holds the total pool of RIDs. When a new domain controller comes online, it's going to get a pool of 500 of these RIDs, and whenever you create a new user, a new computer, or a new security group, one of those RIDs is going to be assigned to that new object. There were issues in the past where certain provisioning systems would over-provision or not effectively use the RIDs, and there was a bug where the RID would be held temporarily before the account was created. The account wouldn't get created, and that RID would not be placed back in the pool. But all of that to say that when a new account in a domain is created, a RID is assigned to that new security principal and is added to the end of the domain SID in order to create that account SID or that security principal SID. So you can look at everything before that last dash, that is the domain SID. If you compare that to all the domains you have trust with, then you can identify which domain that domain SID is associated with. If you don't have a trust with that domain anymore, then you can remove it. Now, if you have a SID in SID history that is for the same domain that user account is in, that is a problem. You should probably reach out to CrowdStrike or Mandiant FireEye to get a compromise analysis done in your environment. There should never be a SID history for a SID in the same domain. It doesn't work that way. They're supposed to be across domains. So yeah, good question about that. Let's see. What's the best way for pen testers to learn more about all these issues quickly? Unfortunately, we don't all come from the blue side. Haha. So fair enough. I have the benefit of having worked with Active Directory since before it was released, or just about when it was released, and working in some very large environments as an Active Directory engineer and admin and things like that. So, and then I went through the Microsoft Certified Master Program for Active Directory, which is not around anymore, which was just an intense process, about a year and a half to go through for me to identify. So I will never know now as much as I knew then during those weeks and months that I was embedded in depth in all this information. So the best way for pen testers to learn more about it is really reading adsecurity.org. Setting up follows for people on Twitter. That I joined Twitter a few years ago in order to follow smart people, learn as much as I could, learn about the issues and concerns. Certainly review and read the blog posts that SpecterOps puts out. Trimarc's security, or Trimarc's content hub, hub.trimarcsecurity.com. We're going to have a lot of really good information that's getting published there, as well as cross-posting from adsecurity.org, so that way you can see a lot of these issues. I have a couple of reading libraries on adsecurity.org, one about Active Directory and how to learn more about how AD works at its core, as well as some of the attacks and defense around Active Directory with article references that are outside of what's on adsecurity.org itself. So hopefully that should help. Let's see. Do you recommend any books, resources outside of adsecurity.org to learn about Active Directory? There are no books that I'm aware of that are specific to Active Directory security, but I would say that one of the best things you can learn is about how Active Directory works. And again, the resources on AD Security will help a lot with that. WPAD, is this still a security issue? I've seen conflicting information on if it was fully fixed patched in 2016. Great question. So there are some mitigations you can do prior to 2016. I don't have a good answer on this. I'm not 100% certain about how WPAD has been handled by Microsoft. My understanding was there were a few very large customers that were using it, so they couldn't just get rid of it. But WPAD, for those that may not be aware, is a way to quickly identify a proxy configuration, so that way the computers in the organization can connect through that proxy to go out to the internet. So this is a fairly old type thing. The problem is things like Responder can take advantage of WPAD and in order to route traffic through the attacker machine. So there were some mitigations that you could do. Microsoft had released some patches. I'm not sure what the state of WPAD is today. I'll see if I can get something tweeted out about that in the coming days. Let's see, there's still a few more questions. The tiered admin model and privileged admin workstations for tier 0 accounts. Does this work in practice? Great question. Benefits outweigh the inconvenience. Another great question. Terminal servers, does PAW a good start instead of second PC for AD admin stuff? Thank you, Alex, for asking this question. This is the lead off to what I'm going to cover in the next webcast on July 15th. I'm going to talk about the tiered admin model, the Red Forest. Do those make sense? What to really focus your time and efforts into? What works in practice? What's really tough? I can tell you right now that I can count the number of organizations that have fully implemented the Microsoft tiered admin model on one hand. I am aware of probably about 30 to 40 Red Forest or admin forests in the United States, and those are some pretty large organizations with a lot of different forests. So yeah, sign up for the this next Securing Active Directory webcast, which will be July 15th, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. You can go to the Trimarc website and hit webcasts and sign up for that there, or the link on the bottom. Best recommendation for handling remote users, almost everyone due to the pandemic, who did not all connect to AD via VPN, experiencing problems with user password expirations, workstation missing new group policy, etc. Yeah, that's a great question. This is very difficult unless you're using a full-time VPN or always-on VPN. Microsoft's Direct Access was one of the kind of the early versions of this, where it was always connected into the environment, so that way it could get those changes. The VPN system itself would have to have its own handling for user password expirations. Oftentimes, this means that the VPN service account needs to be able to change the user's password. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that, other than an always-on VPN or changing the way that you deploy packages to the system and the security policies and things like that from group policy. I think that I know a lot of organizations are looking at cloud MDM type systems in order to do that, especially now, so that way they don't necessarily have to VPN into their corporate network to get this information. They can just be managed by cloud. But it's a great question, and we're going to see, I think, a lot of the different changes along this area as we go forward. Another question, I'm assuming by the same Alex, read-only domain controller, still worthwhile or no longer required? That is a great question, and I'm planning a later webcast, probably after the summer, called Protecting Domain Controllers, no matter where they are, or something along those lines. Read-only domain controllers, to me, a lot of times cause more problems than they're worth, but there are some very good circumstances where read-onlys should be used, such as branch office, where you require a domain controller, which is not as required as it once was, but in the branch office, if it's just going to be behind the receptionist desk or in a broom closet or something like that, where it can't be physically protected. Another interesting use of read-only domain controller would be in a cloud environment. So if you are using Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud as your cloud data center, and you have a bunch of servers that are up there that just need to get authentication information from a read-only or from a domain controller, you can put a read-only domain controller up there. while mitigating some of your risk of putting a full writable domain controller in the cloud environment. So that's an instance where a read-only could make sense. But sure, there's some challenges. I have an article on adsecurity.org on attacking read-only domain controllers, so definitely check that out. We see misconfigurations with read-onlys a lot of the time, and that comes down to who's managing them, what passwords are cached on them, where they're placed, things like that. And let's see, I think there's one or two more. Invoke-TrimarcADChecks works on multi-forest infrastructure. Not really. It's meant for a single domain. So you're going to run it in a domain or target it to a domain. It'll run on that domain. If you have a forest with multiple domains, then you're going to run it in each of those forests, each of those domains or against each of those domains. But keep in mind, it's not really meant to do cross domain. We do a lot of work in our assessment tool for our Active Directory security assessment for cross-domain forest and even cross-forest assessments. There's a lot of nuances and things that happen when you're doing assessments like that and pulling things together, because you're going to have SIDs that aren't resolving across forests or across domains. You'll have scenarios where you have group membership that goes across domains and across forests. So tracking back that can be difficult because of the types. So it doesn't account for everything, but it's really meant for the quick check, really the smaller organizations to be able to check themselves, see what they have, kind of clean up the low-hanging fruit. For larger organizations that are a little more complex, happy to have a conversation with you about what we do and maybe see if there's a way that you can leverage either this tool or maybe something like Ping Castle to check that out and see what can be done. Let's see. Are there any risks around using TTL for domain admin membership, assuming you have a lockdown allow list of accounts that can use this, where and how it is performed, is controlled, etc.? That's a great question. I am going to flag that and make sure I talk about that in our next webcast, because I think there's a lot to that, and I want to make sure that I cover that and talk through that pretty extensively. How should I manage the DSRM administrator password? Great question. One of the easiest ways to take care of the DSRM administrator password for domain controllers, all writable domain controllers, create an account, call it, I don't know, whatever the domain name is, -DSRM or something like that, and then make sure that changes a couple times a year or so. And then what you're going to do is create a group policy that links to your domain controllers OUs or your domain controllers OU, and that group policy is going to set a scheduled task to run an NTDS util command to sync your DSRM password with that account in Active Directory. So if you have something like CyberArk or Secret Server or something that is a password manager, you can have it manage that account. And then every time that scheduled task runs on your domain controllers, it will go ahead and update. So there is a Microsoft article about this. I think I blogged about it before, but I'll tweet out the link and we'll share that link with you. But basically, that's the easiest way to do that. We do cover that as part of our Active Directory security assessment also. Let's see, any thoughts or resources on Sysmon specifically for catching common AD exploits, event IDs, and attributes? No, sorry. We don't provide or talk about Sysmon specifically because that tends to be a local enhancement of the local event log. Jeff again, oddly specific question. Have you seen anyone use Mimikatz set NTLM function to clear LM hashes from migrated DCs? Setting the hash to the current value still counts as a password reset and should clear the LM hash. I have not heard of that. Basically, what should happen is once the user changes their password, assuming that it's configured to no longer store the LM hash, which it shouldn't on any modern OS, once the password has been changed, then obviously it won't create that LM hash or have that LM hash, but I haven't heard of that specifically. Do you recommend using Server Core for production DCs? This is a great question. Server Core is a non-GUI interface for domain controllers, and we have had a couple of customers with Server Core DCs. Assuming that all of your management agents and management systems work fine with Server Core, then yes, go for it. The one thing you may run into is if you have a tiered group that manages domain controllers and they connect in to manage them and check them, if they are not familiar with how administration works from a command line or using the remote admin tools like the newer Admin Center in Windows, then they may have some problems. Other than that, I'd say go for server core for production DCs. Shouldn't be any issues. It does reduce the risk of what can be run and executed on them, but it does increase the management side of things. Let's see. How to investigate unconstrained delegation and convert to constrained. Great question. So we cover this extensively in our Active Directory security assessment, but the basic steps of it are checking to see if it has a spin. If it doesn't have a spin, then it's not needed anymore. You can remove that delegation. The next step is really looking at the event logs to figure out where it's authenticating. And then you can identify what servers it's running on. You can also look at the spins to see what servers it's running on, and then use those to kind of figure out where it is. But then from there, try to map out where the delegated tickets are being used. It does take a little bit of time, but we had a customer that had, I don't know, I think it was 500 or 600 unconstrained delegation accounts when we came in one year. We provided them information and documentation about what those delegation accounts with Kerberos delegation were, where they are, and our recommendations around cleaning that up. And we went back a year later, and they had dropped it down to less than half of what they had before. So it can be done. It just takes some time. Let's see, for disabling inactive accounts, is it best to remove it into groups? Example, Paul belongs to group DF, so remove Paul within group DF. I'd say I wouldn't necessarily handle it that way. I'd say look at those two attributes that I mentioned earlier, the last logon date and the password last set date. Correlate those two and basically say, all right, anyone who hasn't changed their password in say 6 months and hasn't logged on in 6 months, disable that account and move it to an OU called disabled. I would also, if you're using a PowerShell script or something that's doing that disabling and moving, then have it update the description field that says this was disabled on this date because it hadn't logged on since this date and its password hasn't been set since this date. I've done that before for customers, or for a customer, built an extensive script that did that automatically. I don't still have that script, but basically it would go through that process, and then every time it ran, it checked to see what the disabled date was in the description, and then for a threshold beyond that, it would go ahead and delete those accounts. So maybe it was disabled after 6 months, and then 6 months after it was disabled, those accounts are deleted. You want to filter out certain disabled accounts like KerbTDT and anything else that you need to keep, so you can have it ignore. I would have it ignore specific accounts, or even OUs would be better. So that way, if you have an OU that is accepted from that, such as users who are on temporary assignment elsewhere, for example. Let's see. What about using Azure AD joined remote systems to help manage instead of replacing AD with tools like Jump Cloud? That's a great question. I'm not going to talk about Jump Cloud here, but yes, you can absolutely use Azure AD and Azure in order to help manage Active Directory. I'll be talking a lot about how to do that in a more modern way, an approach to an AD Red Forest type approach on July 15th. Let's see, password writeback in AD Sync for remote users and using Intune. Wow, there's a lot there. I'm sorry, I don't know where to begin with that. So maybe I'll cover that in a later webcast on Azure AD and Office 365 and managing those systems. Let's see, any recommendations on when on-prem AD gets joined to Azure AD? No, not in this talk. I will probably add that for a future Azure AD Office 365 talk. Does the script differentiate between being unable to do a particular test due to permissions versus that test passing or failing? No, it does not. It is a very basic check. As part of our Active Directory security assessment, we do some additional checks to figure out why or how we can't see something. And we know through our experience what we should be able to see versus what we can't. Normally, we have to get some additional data from the customers or have them run something so that we can see that. But when we do Active Directory security assessments, we ask for our assessment account to be added to any of the view-only or audit type groups that may be able to see OUs or groups or environments or group policies within AD that have been locked down, so the authenticated users can't see them anymore. But by default, it should be able to see everything. let's see, I might have already read this, but it's maybe it's similar. Are there any risks around using TTL for domain admin membership, assuming you have a lockdown? Yeah, I'm going to cover this as we talk about on the next webcast. So join us on July 15th and in the next webcast where I talk about secure administration of Active Directory. Let's see, is it possible to only give access to remove accounts from a group but not add? I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'll have to look that up. I believe that the ACLs are set for modify, which means add remove versus just an add. For moving disabled accounts, is there risk for history actions for these accounts? So I'll say that the best way to manage these is to put detailed information in the description so that we have some information around it. But I'm going to add to this question and say that one of the questions we've had about deleting accounts is that you lose that SID that you would normally have to be able to resolve SIDs later on. If this is important, then you can run a PowerShell script that gets the get 80 user filter star, get 80 group filter star, get 80 computer filter star. So that way you should have most of the objects that have security principles, and then have it output to a CSV file that has the SID and the distinguished name of that object and that object type, and just have that dump that to CSVs. That way, if you ever need to go back, you can to see what the SIDs are. What are the different methods that a spin can be duplicated for different users? So in the lab, I could not get it to work for the same domain, but I was able to do it across domains by clicking OK at the same time. This typically only happens when it's set up across multiple domain controllers, or someone is setting up at the same time on different DCs and they're using different accounts. But generally, it's more difficult now than it used to be in order to duplicate SIDs. Like if you're using set spin, it's going to scan AD to see if there's already a spin for it. Okay. Will, can you specify any features or parts of the webinar that are subscription specific and what subscription level they are available for? All of this is free that I've talked about. You can use all this. The PowerShell script is going to be free. Our webcasts are free, so there is no subscription there. As far as our security security assessments, obviously there's a cost associated with that, but those are engagements that you can reach out to us and we can have that conversation about what you're interested in. If the primary group ID is set for a user and they are not in the group itself, does this give the user the same privileges as if they're in the group? Domain admins comes to mind, for example. So primary group ID is a very interesting configuration within Active Directory. You have primary group ID, which is typically set to domain users. This is something we scan for and check and do extensive checks when we do our Active Directory security assessment. Oftentimes, you'll see a primary group ID set to something else, some other group in the environment. And sometimes you'll see that it's set to domain admins. Primary group ID is a weird thing because you can have a user that has a primary group ID of domain users, but if you're using a standard LDAP query to see what the membership of that group is from that user, you're not going to see domain users. If you're using the Microsoft PowerShell commandlets or Active Directory using computers, you're going to see that they are a member of that group because the tool automatically adds the primary group ID into the group membership for that user. So it's kind of this weird other thing that happens. It's a filtering mechanism, from what I can tell, to reduce the load of having to look at domain users for all the users, for example. So you could add someone to domain admins and then change your primary group ID to be domain admins, and then try to do some quirks to show that they are not a domain admins, but they are. But generally speaking, the Microsoft admin tools will see that still, but the LDAP tools may not. So that's where it can get interesting. Let's see. Have you seen many folks using agent-based vulnerability scanners? Example, Nessus. Are there any risks around this to be aware of? I'd say agent-based has become certainly more popular because of the credential issues, but no, nothing specific. Does the audit policy also should be set for regular servers as well, since those are just for domain controllers? Yes. So if you go to adsecurity.org, I have an article on securing domain controllers, which has auditing recommendations for domain controllers. I have auditing recommendations, I believe, also for workstations, but I'm not sure about servers. If you check out CIS, Center for Information Security, or Internet Security, they have some recommendations around auditing. Microsoft has recommendations for auditing as well. And of course, as part of our security assessments, we cover some of that also. Let's see. What's your take on secure workstations in a VM versus dedicated hardware? We're going to talk about that on July 15th. So please join us for that webcast. And I think those are all of the most liked questions. And we are well over time anyway. I want to thank the over 100 people that continued to stay online with us and listen to me answer these questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much for joining us. It was great to see such a wonderful response and interest in securing Active Directory. I really hope that this has been helpful for you to better secure your AD environment, identify those things that should be cleaned up and how to do that. As I mentioned, we are going to have the recording of this webcast as well as the slides and the PowerShell script available for you on the Trimarc website within the next couple of days. We will probably be updating the Trimarc script, this Invoke-TrimarcADChecks in the near future with some other checks that can be done and possibly some bug fixes as well. But thank you very much. Appreciate you attending. This has been a great time for me to be able to talk to everyone from the comfort of my home as well. And I hope everyone takes care, and I'll see you next time, July 15th. Take care. Bye-bye.